I had just returned from Germany, Ramstein Air Base, after 36 hours in transit. My boots were still dusted with desert sand, my uniform creased from too many hours in the same seat, my spine aching from turbulence and exhaustion. Home was supposed to feel like a landing. Instead, it felt like a trap. The sun was setting behind the hills of Colorado Springs, casting a dull amber light across the porch of the house I used to call ours. There, tucked against the edge of the welcome mat, sat an envelope. Just one. Plain white. My name printed in bold black letters that I recognized immediately. No return address. But I didn't need one. I stood there in silence for a long moment, wind catching the hem of my coat, rattling the dead leaves on the sidewalk. I knew that paper weighed less than a feather, but somehow it felt heavier than my rucksack. I bent down, picked it up, fingers trembling only slightly. I've held rifles steadier than this, briefings more brutal than this. But this? This wasn't war. This was something colder. I opened the door, stepped inside, and dropped my keys into the ceramic dish by the door, like I'd done 100 times before. The scent of lavender cleaner still hung faintly in the air. The walls still held the framed photos of Miles. First steps, first day of school, his gap-toothed smile beaming into the camera like he didn't know the world could break. I didn't even take off my boots. I just stood in the entryway, envelope in hand, heart pounding louder than any battlefield I'd ever stood on. I opened it. No salutation, no sentiment. Just legal language. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Request for full custody. My vision didn't blur. I didn't cry. My training kicked in too hard for that. Instead, my eyes scanned the second page, and that's when I saw it. Witness, Margaret Reed. My mother. The same woman who braided my hair the night before I left for basic training. The same woman who held Miles the day he was born and whispered, "He's going to love you forever." Now, she stood on the opposite side of a courtroom I hadn't even entered yet. I walked slowly to the living room, the envelope limp in my hand now. I sat on the edge of the couch, boots still on, dirt still clinging to the soles. Across from me was a photo of the three of us, me, Matthew, and Miles. Smiling, whole, a lie. I took off my wedding ring. It slid off too easily. I set it on the coffee table next to a picture of Miles on my shoulders, both of us laughing in a park somewhere in Arizona, where the sun felt too big and time felt too small. My hand lingered on the photo frame. Something inside me cracked. Quietly. Not with screams, not with shouts, but with silence. The kind of silence that sinks deep into bone. They thought this letter would break me. But they forgot one thing. I've walked through war zones. And if they thought I'd surrender my son, my voice, my truth, they'd just declared war on the wrong mother. They never tell you the hardest war isn't the one you fight overseas. It's the one you fight at your own dinner table. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen counter, still in uniform, the envelope lying open beside a cold cup of coffee. The kind of night where even silence feels loud, where every creak of the house sounds like betrayal. I stared at the wall across from me, the gallery of family photos I once thought would last forever. Matthew in uniform at our wedding, me holding baby Miles at the hospital, my mother holding both of us like we were her legacy, my sister April laughing beside a Christmas tree, red tinsel in her hair. All of it looked like a museum now, a history of things that used to mean something. Somewhere between promotions and deployments, between medals and missed birthdays, the cracks started showing. But I didn't see them then. Or maybe I did, and I just refused to look. When Miles was 4, I missed his kindergarten recital because I was grounded on base after a security breach. I remember calling home, voice thick with apology. Matthew told me not to worry. But something in his tone had already changed. The first time my mother hinted that maybe I was too committed to the job, it was over dinner. I had flown in from Okinawa for a 72-hour leave and barely made it to her house in time for Thanksgiving. She set the pie down, looked at me over her glasses, and said, "You know, Miles doesn't talk about you the way he used to." It was a small thing, a passing comment, but it cut like wire through skin, and it never stopped. Every visit became a trial. My career was too masculine, my voice too sharp, my expectations too rigid, and through it all, I stayed quiet. Because I thought they'd come around. because I thought they'd see the woman behind the uniform. They didn't. Matthew found comfort in others, first in resentment, then in silence, and finally, inevitably, in Rebecca. She was warm, soft-spoken, present, everything I wasn't, everything I didn't know how to be, and my mother adored her. I came home from deployment one year and found Rebecca's shoes by the front door, her jacket on the hook next to mine. When I confronted Matthew, he just shrugged. "You're always gone, Elle. Someone has to show up." And that was it. No fight, no tears, just the quiet sting of a door that had already closed. But it wasn't until my own mother stood beside him in court filings that I realized the war had come home. That this battle wasn't just between me and a broken marriage. This was about erasure, about rewriting my place in my own story. They weren't just trying to win custody, they were trying to erase my motherhood, my presence, my identity. And worst of all, they thought I'd let them. They thought I'd roll over, apologize, shrink. They mistook discipline for detachment, silence for surrender. But I've walked through cities reduced to rubble. I've carried men bleeding out on their last breath. I've saluted flags lowered over lives cut short. And if they think I won't fight for my son the way I've fought for this country, they've forgotten who raised me. Because I wasn't just trained for war, I was born into one. And this time, I'm not marching for a flag, I'm marching for miles. The morning after the envelope, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, toothbrush in hand, but unmoving. The sun hadn't fully risen. The light was gray, quiet, hesitant, just like me. My reflection looked back with eyes I barely recognized, tired, lined, sharp around the edges. I had worn this uniform for 2 decades, flown through sandstorms, commanded teams, made decisions in seconds that would follow me for years. And yet, in that moment, I couldn't decide whether I was looking at a woman or just the outline of one. I leaned closer. There, in the upper corner of the mirror, barely visible in the right light, was a hairline crack. I hadn't noticed it before. Thin, jagged, a scar across the glass. I reached up, fingertip hovering near the fracture. It reminded me of something. Me. Not broken, but changed. Not shattered, but compromised. There's a quiet kind of damage that comes from being misunderstood for too long. You don't fall apart in one big crash. You erode, little by little, comment by comment, absence by absence. And when people stop seeing you for who you are, you start forgetting too. I remembered how Miles used to light up when I walked through the door, tiny arms flung wide, shouting, "Mommy's home!" But lately, he'd grown quieter. He paused before hugging me, looked up at me like I was someone he needed to study first, like he wasn't sure who I was anymore. And that terrified me, because I wasn't sure either. Was I still a mother, or just a visitor with a schedule? Was I still Eleanor, or just Colonel Reed? I sat on the edge of the bathtub, elbows on knees, uniform sleeves rolled up just enough to see the line where sunburn met pale skin. The human part of me, the woman underneath the medals. I thought about my own mother, how she used to brush my hair, how she told me I could be anything, as long as I worked hard enough. But she hadn't meant this. She hadn't meant soldier. She hadn't meant the kind of mother who has to schedule birthdays around deployment windows. She'd meant the kind who stays close, who bakes cookies, who's always there. So when I became someone else, she began to pull away. Not in anger, but in disappointment. I could see it now, how I had been carrying that disappointment like an extra pack on my back, trying to prove I was still worthy of love, still worthy of motherhood. And all the while, the people closest to me were rewriting my story in their own words. She's cold. She's too strict. She's not maternal. But the truth is, they never tried to see me, and I never gave them the chance. I armored myself so well for the battlefield. I forgot how to be unarmored at home. I looked back at the mirror. The crack was still there, still imperfect, still visible. And strangely, it comforted me, because it reminded me of something important. You don't have to be unbroken to be strong. Some of the most powerful things in the world carry scars. So I stood up, straightened my shoulders, brushed my teeth, and whispered to the woman in the mirror, "You're not done." They thought I'd stay quiet. that I'd let them build their version of me and never challenge a single word of it. They were wrong. I didn't come for revenge. I came for truth. And truth doesn't scream. It gathers, it waits, and then it strikes. I started with the facts, court filings, transcripts, every statement made under oath, every email exchange that raised a red flag. I laid it all out on my dining table, miles of paper, colored tabs, highlighters bleeding across timelines and contradictions. Every night after Miles went to sleep, on the nights I still had him, I stayed up, cross-referencing legal terms with memory. I remembered everything, dates Matthew said I wasn't home. I found the boarding passes, the letters from Miles I kept tucked in my field journal, even a voicemail from his school, time-stamped, where I answered from overseas. They wanted to build a case on absence? I was going to show them presence, the kind that doesn't post photos, but leaves fingerprints on a child's life. Then came Rebecca, Matthew's new partner, the woman who baked cookies and smiled sweetly in court. My mother called her balanced. My sister called her a stable influence. But someone, I still don't know who, sent me an anonymous message. Check her record, for Miles's sake. At first I ignored it. I didn't want to be paranoid, didn't want to fight dirty. But instinct whispered. And instinct had kept me alive in places maps couldn't name. So I looked. Her name wasn't Rebecca Lane, not originally. In New Mexico, under her previous married name, she had a sealed history. 2 separate welfare investigations. One confirmed case of neglect. Another of verbal abuse toward a minor, dismissed due to insufficient evidence, but the note was there, clear as day. I printed everything. Quietly, carefully. No threats, no announcements, just added it to the file. Then I reached out to my people, not the ones who saluted me, the ones who knew me beyond the medals. A combat medic I mentored in Kandahar, a colonel I worked under during joint ops in Seoul, a chaplain who saw me comfort a grieving wife in a burned-down chapel in Mosul. They sent letters, pages of testimony, about leadership, about character, about motherhood in the margins of war. I included photos, too, of me and Miles fishing in the Rockies, carving pumpkins on my one weekend home, building a cardboard spaceship in the garage at midnight because he'd had a bad dream. They said I was cold, but the evidence told another story, one built on presence in the ways that matter most. Matthew's side wasn't prepared for that. They thought they'd be fighting a soldier. What they got was a mother who knew how to build a case like a battle plan, not emotional, not reactive, just relentless. The file sat 3 inches thick, labeled, tabbed, chronological, indisputable. On the last page, I clipped a note, just 2 words, I remember. Because they thought I'd forget who I was. They thought I'd get lost in shame, in silence, in fear. But what they didn't expect was a cracked mirror that could still reflect the truth. A woman who had been quiet, but never asleep. The courthouse smelled like cold air and polished wood. I'd been in rooms like this before, not with judges, but with generals. But today wasn't war, it was worse. This was personal. I didn't wear black, didn't try to look soft, didn't try to look less intimidating. I wore my full dress blues, ribbons, medals, insignia. Not for them, not for show, but for me. Each thread, each stripe carried something I'd bled for. Each piece of brass was a story I'd survived, and today, they would have to look at every inch of it. When I stepped through the courtroom doors, the air changed. I didn't have to say a word. Silence said it for me. Reporters lowered their pens. My sister's jaw clenched. Matthew's lawyer whispered something fast into his ear. Even the judge stood. He didn't need to. There's no rule that says a family court judge has to rise when an officer enters the room. But he did. And that single motion cracked the tension wide open. I walked slowly, deliberately, heels clicking against tile, echoing louder than anything anyone dared to say. My mother was seated on the right. Her eyes met mine for half a second, then dropped to her lap. Rebecca sat beside Matthew. She smiled, tight, rehearsed. But when I met her gaze, it faltered. Just slightly, just enough. I sat down without a sound, my hands folded, my back straight, my file, the one they didn't expect, already on the table. Then the screen was rolled in. No one knew what was coming. My attorney pressed play, and there it was. First angle, my dash cam. blue and red lights flashing in the rear view. My voice, calm, direct. The officers, short, clipped, escalating. I didn't yell, I didn't resist. I passed every test they threw at me. And still, he wrote the ticket. Not because I did something wrong, but because I didn't fit what he expected. Second angle, his body cam, closer, raw. You could hear it, the unspoken judgment, the irritation, the quiet disrespect masked as procedure. In that moment, I wasn't a colonel, I wasn't a mother, I was just a problem to control. When the screen went black, the room didn't move. No shifting, no coughs, no whispers, just silence. The kind that makes your ribs feel too tight, the kind that presses behind your eyes. Then, my attorney's voice steady. Colonel Reed, at any point did you fail to comply with a lawful order? No, I said clearly. Did you ever raise your voice? No. Did you immediately identify yourself as a federal officer in a government vehicle? Yes, without hesitation. He nodded, then looked at the jury. And that's when I saw it. The shift. Not in the evidence, but in their faces. They stopped seeing what they'd heard in whispers, and started seeing me. The judge leaned forward, tapping his pen once against the table. No reprimands, no theatrics, just truth, settling like dust after a storm. I didn't glance at Matthew, didn't need to, but I saw his shoulders drop, just slightly. The first sign he realized the ground was shifting beneath him. I breathed in, slow, out, steady. No anger, no smugness, just strength, wrapped in silence. Because some battles aren't won with volume. Some are won the moment your truth walks into the room, and no one can look away. I didn't cry when the judge ruled in my favor. I didn't smile either. The gavel came down with a soft click, and the room exhaled like it had been holding its breath for weeks. Matthew didn't say a word. My sister looked away. My mother, well, even she couldn't meet my eyes. But I wasn't looking for them. I was looking for Miles. The courtroom emptied slowly. Lawyers gathered their files. Reporters whispered into their phones. Rebecca disappeared down the hall. I stood alone for a moment. Let the silence settle on my shoulders. Let the weight lift. Not all the way, but enough to feel human again. And then I walked outside. He was sitting on the courthouse steps, a gray hoodie, hands in his pockets, legs swinging slightly. Miles. 12 years old, but suddenly so much older. He looked up the second I stepped into the sunlight. No smile, no tears, just wide, steady eyes. I stopped halfway down the steps. I didn't say his name, didn't rush in for a hug, didn't offer promises I couldn't keep. I just stood there, letting him see me. Not the rank, not the ribbons. Me. And then, he moved. Miles stood up, walked to me slowly, and reached out. His fingers found mine, small, warm, sure. I didn't squeeze first. He did, and in that moment I broke. Not on the outside, but in the quietest place inside me. The place that had been waiting for him, even when I didn't know if he'd ever come back. He didn't say, I forgive you. Didn't say, I missed you. He didn't need to. That one gesture, his hand in mine, was more than enough. We sat on the bench just outside the building. People passed, some stared, some didn't. We didn't speak for a long time. I let the silence breathe. Let it exist without filling it with apologies or explanations. Because some wounds don't heal through words. They heal through presence, through showing up again and again, until trust starts to grow back like a scar over time. Eventually, he looked at me. His voice was small but steady. You look different. I nodded. I feel different. He tilted his head, thoughtful. Not bad different. I smiled, barely. He leaned against me then, his shoulder touching mine. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself rest in that moment. No armor, no strategy, just a mother and her son. That night, when I tucked him into bed, he didn't ask why I had left so much. Didn't ask why Grandma said the things she did. Didn't ask why Daddy was angry. He just said, Are you staying? And I whispered, As long as you want me to. He didn't answer with words, just reached up and held my hand. Because the hardest part of losing connection is not knowing if the hand you reach for will reach back. And that night, he did. 2 weeks after the verdict, we sat on a park bench in the late afternoon sun. No courtroom, no uniform, just me and Miles. A half-melted ice cream cone dripped down his fingers, and he laughed like the world had never tried to steal him away. And maybe, for a moment, it hadn't. I watched him kick his shoes off in the grass, watched the way he squinted into the sun, watched him live. It struck me how much time I had spent fighting, and how little I had spent just being. I used to think I had to earn my way back, through medals, through court victories, through proving myself again and again. But this quiet, ordinary moment with my son was the real victory, because this time, I wasn't fighting to be seen. I was already there. He offered me a bite of his cone, sticky, sweet. I took it, and we laughed, a real laugh, the kind that doesn't need permission. I looked at him, really looked. The curve of his nose, the way his front teeth had finally grown back in, the faint freckles across his cheeks, all the small things I had missed, in the name of service, in the name of sacrifice. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room. No files, no court papers, just the silence I had once feared, now folded around me like a blanket. I looked over at the mantel. The photo of us, laughing in that Arizona park, still stood there. But something had changed. This time I wasn't staring at a memory I had lost. I was sitting in the life I still had. I reached for the letter, the one I'd written to him but never sent, unfolded it, added one final line at the bottom. They said I failed. Maybe I did, but I got back up, and I'll keep getting back up. I signed it, folded it carefully, and placed it in the top drawer of his desk, not for today, but for someday. Because the truth is, some battles aren't won with noise, some don't end with applause, some don't need a final speech, some just end in silence. The kind of silence that comes after a long storm, the kind that lets you breathe again. When I turned out the light, I paused in the doorway of his room. He was asleep, peaceful, one hand tucked under his cheek, the other still loosely holding the corner of the blanket I'd tucked in. I smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because we were still here, still healing, still standing. And that is enough. Sometimes victory doesn't look like applause. It doesn't look like headlines or fireworks. Sometimes it's just a mother and her son sharing an ice cream cone on a quiet afternoon after everything tried to keep them apart. This wasn't a story about revenge. Not really. It was a story about truth, about what happens when silence becomes strength, about what it means to rise, not with rage, but with quiet resolve. To fight, not to destroy, but to protect what's sacred. Eleanor didn't win because she shouted louder. She won because she stood still long enough for the truth to rise. And in the end, it wasn't the courtroom that healed her. It was the moment her son reached back for her hand. That's the kind of justice we believe in here. Quiet, earned, unshakable.